Hi, John.
Hi, Maytal. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Good, good. I've got
Good.
a bit of a uh, hip nerve problem, but it's fine when I'm sitting. So let's go to work.
Okay. Then this is the perfect format for us. um, and nice to see you again, and welcome back. And not only nice to see you, but it was very nice to see you also on CBC and CTV this past week. And we'll share some of those links for viewers and listeners as well. And I want to talk about some of those things that you were talking about in other media appearances. So let's just jump right in. I think the big news this week, not only internationally, but it also does affect Canada, is Trump announcing moving to phase two of the ceasefire deal and announcing the further details about the Board of Peace. And we know that he has extended an invite to Prime Minister Mark Carney to be a part of the Board of Peace. And we know that Carney has accepted in principle because we're still waiting for some details. So there's, I think, still a lot by answering some questions, we have opened up a lot more questions. And I'm just wondering, let's start at the high level and then we can dig in a little bit more. What are your first impressions of what we're hearing, Carney's reaction of other leaders, etc.?
Well, let me start by going back a little bit. I think everybody would prefer if the United Nations was functioning properly and the Security Council was functioning, and it wasn't just Donald Trump or, as has been the case for many, many years, just the United States that is the key player on Israel-Palestine. But accepting that the UN has really not played a role, although they did unanimously accept the peace plan, um, they have not played a role in Israel Palestine for a long time, except passing a lot of resolutions that don't really have much effect. So we're stuck with the Americans. And in 2026, we're stuck with Donald Trump. On the positive side, he did end the fighting for the most part, although we know that hundreds of Palestinians have been killed and Hamas is still not disarmed, etc. But he stopped the massive killing, and some aid is flowing, so that's good. And the fact that we're moving to phase two, which, if it were successful, would mean that Israel would withdraw to its borders, essentially, and that Hamas would be disarmed, decommissioned, a combination thereof, and that the governance of the Gaza Strip would essentially day-to-day governments would be turned over to a Palestinian technocratic committee, which has been named and has met, and they would be overseen by a couple of boards with Donald Trump at the top. So if that were all to work, and if that committee could begin functioning, and if humanitarian assistance were increased, and if the beginning of the clearance of the rubble and the beginning of new construction, if that were to happen, then this would be great. I know that people are extremely cynical about it happening. They're extremely cynical, because the Israelis are not keen for it to happen. And Netanyahu has already said that he disapproves the Palestinian Technocratic Committee. He still hasn't opened up Rafah, etc. And they're extremely cynical because it's Donald Trump and his band of merry men, Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Kushner, and others who seem to be kind of running this. So, my initial reaction is I understand the cynicism, but it's the only game in town. This is unlike Greenland, for example, where I 100% support pushback on Donald Trump. There should be no question about it. Pushback on Donald Trump here, and you're left with the status quo. And frankly, the status quo with 53% of Gaza being controlled by Israel and them shooting anyone that comes anywhere near an undefined yellow line and not enough humanitarian aid coming in and no progress, that's not much of an alternative. So that's more or less where I'm at. On Prime Minister Carney, I understand that today they said they would not be contributing $1 billion, which is fine. We're in it for 3 years. If we finally do accept, the Prime Minister said he wants more information. He particularly highlighted humanitarian affairs and wanting to make sure that the assistance was coming in at full force, which it's not yet. So we're waiting and seeing. I've seen that President Macron has decided not to join. That's fine. I've said before that, there's a couple of reasons why Carney is joining. I think the first is he doesn't want to piss off President Trump. He wants to do everything he can without committing $1 billion to be on side. Secondly, if this were to really function, as a former bank governor, Canada, the UK, a guy with lots of Wall Street investment finance experience, he could actually play a positive role, not only in getting money in, but making sure it's accountable and transparent, etc. So now that's all a little bit wishful thinking. That's dependent on the fact that this board will actually be doing something and it won't just be controlled by Donald Trump. So I think that's where we're at there. I'm going to be writing a piece for the Toronto Star this evening, which will more or less say the same, and I'll send it to you for inclusion in the JSpace weekly newsletter.
Great, good. Which we always love to include, and we always love having your voice there. I think the one piece, I mean, I obviously agree with you. I think, the one piece on Carney, you're right, lots of questions still, and probably, as I said, more questions than answers. But I think for as much as I've seen a lot of whiplash of people not exactly knowing where they fall on this or how they feel about it, if Carney can have a positive influence, I think this is probably one of those situations where, to the extent that he can, better to be on the inside knowing what's happening than pushing from the outside. So obviously the calculations that Carney have are maybe different than Macron or any other leaders. On that, so you already mentioned, yes, Israel's still occupying about 53% of the Strip. Hamas no longer, still not disarmed. One hostage body, Ran Gvili, still remains, having not been returned. As you said, Rafah still not open. The longer, it also kind of feels like the longer we wait on this, the less a possibility of seeing that change. We see that Hamas is, not only have they not disarmed, we see that they're building up strength again and are de facto once again ruling Gaza. And so I'm just wondering, how much longer can we actually wait? And because of all those things that we noted in terms of Israel still being in the Strip, one hostage body still not being returned, Hamas still, not disarming, how do we move? Like, we're talking about this as moving to phase 2, but will it help? Will it actually move anything to phase 2? Are there any plans to show that that can actually happen, or is this largely performative at this point?
Well, at this point, not much is happening. On the last dead hostage, I have read that Hamas is working with the Red Cross, and they really are trying to resolve that. There's no point in having that body there. Right. It's not leverage for anybody, and it must and should go home. You're absolutely right. As I said, the status quo is not acceptable. We do have to move. There certainly are possibilities if a Palestinian technocratic government does move into the Strip and they begin working with Hamas to, first of all, deal with, there are three sort of elements. There's the infrastructure, the tunnels. That's number one. Israel's very concerned that they be dealt with. Secondly, are the heavy weapons, the RPGs, the rockets, etc. And then there are sort of the weapons that Hamas wants to use to defend itself, because there are plenty of people in Gaza that would like to get rid of them as well, including groups funded by Israel, who are obviously completely opposed to Hamas. So that is a process. We know what has to be done. The Palestinian Authority has said they don't want to disarm Hamas, they don't want to get involved. And the Muslim countries that have talked about being part of the International Stabilization Force have also said that they don't want to do this. So it's really, if that technocratic government, which has, I don't know if you've seen the charts, but every one of the members has a responsibility. Somebody for infrastructure, somebody for finance, somebody for policing, etc. That's the body, I think, that it's a legitimate Palestinian, Gaza-based body. If it is allowed to function and can deal with Hamas, then we're into the first step. Then you have to have bona fides on the Israeli side that, yes, this process has begun and we've dealt with the tunnels and we're about to deal with the heavy weapons. You now should be withdrawing from the yellow line back further, as an act of good faith. Then, of course, that's just one thing. At the same time, the humanitarian aid should be beginning to flow. That one is unclear to me, because in the latest Board of Peace declarations, they talk about private companies, or it being held by private organizations. I really don't know what that means. Are they going to include nonprofits, or are they somehow buying into this determination by Israel that 37 organizations that have been distributing food and providing humanitarian assistance aren't going to function? I don't know. But certainly the humanitarian assistance factor has to be dealt with, and the Prime Minister highlighted that. So that should happen. And then, of course, they've talked about clearing the rubble. The man on the technocratic committee who's responsible for that recently said it's going to take 3 years and X number of $1 billion. And we could actually create, as Dubai has, you could create an extension of Gaza into the water. There's so much rubble, and create, a port or something else. I don't know whether any of that's true, but people are thinking. So there are things to do. Query whether, Trump and his team are going to keep pushing this forward and pushing the Israelis back, in a sense of you've got to let this begin to happen.
So, well, in tandem with all of that, and not entirely disconnected from it, we know that Hamas's greatest backer is the Iranian regime, and we are now seeing continued protests in Iran. We talked about them last week. In your absence, we had a guest join us, an Iranian Jewish American, join us and kind of talk about, what his own personal feelings about it. But I'm wondering, as these protests continue, as the complete internet blackout continues in Iran, first of all, I guess, what are you seeing, or what are you thinking about this kind of I guess, moment of nothing really happening? No decisive action has been taken, but there's a lot of talk about what might happen. What might we see the Americans do? What might we see Israel do? And does it have any, is happening to the Iranian regime, will it have any effect on Hamas or any of the other terrorist organizations that they are sponsors of, Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc.? Is it affecting any of them?
Yeah. Well, I think let's start with the last thing that you raised. I think there's no doubt that a combination of Israel's actions against the Houthis, against Hezbollah, against Hamas, have not only weakened them, but the economic crisis in Iran is no doubt having an effect. And part of the criticism of the protesters is not only that we don't have water and there's massive inflation, but you are spending huge amounts of dollars to fund these proxies when we are suffering. And I think that's highlighted. The other thing that I think I've found fascinating is that Israel seems to be adamant and is making its views known to Trump that don't go in there at this point. And I think that the intelligent analysts around, and certainly those in Israel, are saying that that will only exacerbate the situation. You're not going to be able to go in there and pick up Khamenei the way that they picked up Maduro. And even if you did, you still got the Revolutionary Guard in massive numbers there. So it's not Venezuela, and it's not Grenada, and it's not Panama. This is big time. And Donald Trump, do you really want to get involved in a full scale battle? Or the Economist in a panel, all of the economists seem to think about a week ago that America would strike, but that it would just be pro forma strike. I see that has not happened. I was surprised they said it and thought it. It has not happened. Now, unfortunately, there are no protests going on right now, as I understand it. The numbers that were killed seem to vary from 3,000 to 5,000 and maybe more, maybe significantly more. It's just not known. And I think, at least for now, the protests have been quelled. The feelings that the protesters and their families have against the regime have obviously heightened. I think now there's a combination of not only are you not dealing with the economy and dealing with water and dealing with our daily problems, but you've gone out and really massacred our children. And so I think, a lot of people are kind of, let's wait and see what is going to happen next, and maybe don't rock the boat right now. The sanctions are obviously contributing to this economic problem, and the average Iranian with whom we don't have a problem, and the world doesn't have a problem, is really suffering. There's another element to this that you and I just sort of discussed before we came on, which is some in the community seem to be suggesting that we liberal Jews are somehow should be criticized because we're not criticizing the Iranian regime as much as we criticize the current coalition and its actions in Israel. Well, I mean, the Iranians are criticizing the Iranian regime. We find it abhorrent, but it's sort of not the progressive Jewish community's duty to jump in on necessarily Iran or on the Congo or in any other horrible incidences. We progressive Jews kind of focus on Israel because Israel is part of us, and we want Israel to be a better Israel. Sure, we want Iran to be better, but I don't feel a compulsion to be criticizing the mullahs. There's a whole world out there criticizing the mullahs, and we all know it's a terrible regime, and the UN has sanctioned them, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and I think, yeah, I mean, as we were kind of discussing earlier, like on the, for folks who see it as maybe something that is hypocritical, I would say actually, doesn't it further justify that what we have always been arguing, which is you support people, but you criticize regimes or you criticize corrupt leaders. And, I think that we actually, I think for especially progressive Jews, a lot of what we're seeing from the Iranian people on the streets is no different than, or I mean, it is different, but there is a lot there that is actually incredibly relatable to us in terms of Israelis being on the streets for the past, 3 years. because they recognize that, to love a country or to love your nation or to love your fellow people and citizens also mean looking at when you have leaders who are working against that, that you should say something, and it is your duty to speak up. So the complete opposite of it being hypocritical, I think that it is actually kind of proving that point, that it is up first and foremost to the people to fight for and advocate for the future and the nation and the country and the leadership that they want to see.
Well, and it equally applies to the fact that Persians, Iranians in the diaspora are out in huge numbers,
They
not
are, yeah.
because they hate Iran, but they want Iran to be a better Iran. Some of them are prepared to have a dictator again, as long as it's not a Muslim cleric and the guard is not totally in control of the military and companies, etc., and the oil. And some of them want a full-fledged democracy, etc. They're not necessarily united, but they're certainly united in criticizing their government, not their country, and that's where we find ourselves
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, and let me ask you actually just one last question on that I was curious about. You're right, they're not, and it's the same with Israel, right? We see that the folks that are out in the streets protesting are not, they're not all saying that they're going to vote for Naftali Bennett's party or all united in voting for a Democratim. Like they're all kind of all over the place. What binds them is kind of being anti-Netanyahu or wanting a state commission of inquiry, being anti-judicial overhaul, etc. So that's kind of the question too with Iran, though, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but if we were to see the regime topple, is there kind of a accepted or ready to go alternative to replace the regime? Like, what would happen if it toppled? It would be kind of, there wouldn't be, we're not looking at clear solution as to what would come next. Is that correct?
That's correct. Unfortunately, you know that the Shah's son, uh, who lives in America and really hasn't been involved until recently, has now kind of set himself up as the person that might be able to go in there and unite forces. He's not intending to, eliminate the Revolutionary Guard and the government. What he's hoping to do is to go in at the top and bring a more progressive, liberal, but I don't know if he's even talking in the first instance of holding free and fair elections,
Mm.
etc. But he wants to go in there. He doesn't want to duplicate an Iraq where you eliminate everybody and you're left with chaos. I don't know how realistic that is, and I do know that there are many who do not support a Shah's son being the man to go in there. So I don't think there is anybody in Iran right now that is prepared to take over the leadership. I don't even know if there's, other than the Shah's son, whether there's somebody like in Venezuela, where at least we thought the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize, whose name escapes me right now, was seen as the person that could move in, given that her party had won a majority in the last election. That doesn't even seem to be available to the Iranians. So it's a very complicated situation, and part of the reason that you don't want to necessarily go in there and topple Khamenei is that you don't know who is going to replace him.
Great. Maria Corina Machado.
That's it. Thank you.
Yes.
I was thinking Machado. It's much.
Yeah.
Who no longer has the Nobel
Right.
because she gave
Right.
it to Donald, and she'll
Right.
get nothing for that.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So let's bring it back. We zoomed out a bit in the region. Let's bring it back in and zoom in back into the Israel-Palestine region and into a slightly different region. Another thing that happened last week was we know that construction tenders have now been issued to Israeli construction firms for the beginning of settlement building in the quite controversial E1 area of the occupied territories, East Jerusalem. We know there's about 3,400 housing units that they're talking about constructing. One of the things that we recently started advocating for specifically when it comes to sanctions through our policy center is also sanctions from the Canadian government on these construction companies that bid on and agree to do construction in the occupied territories. I E1, which is generally referred to as the doomsday settlements because of what they will do to the two-state solution. I mean, I don't think that even if they build these 3,400 units, I don't think that means the two-state solution is dead, but it's definitely more and more on its last legs, perhaps even last leg. Sanctions, of course, and those are very targeted sanctions. So I think that could be really interesting to see. But what else? We see Trump pushing on Netanyahu quite a bit when it comes to Gaza, but seemingly really giving free range on any of the expansion in the occupied territories. So, what do you think happens next there, and how can we be effective in pushing back on it?
Yeah, I think that's it's really key. I mean, let's step back for a minute. Uh, Donald Trump essentially told Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich, you cannot formally annex. So people kind of took a deep breath, as they did during his last administration when he prevented that in order to get the Abraham Accords signed. But that's de jure annexation, and de facto annexation has been going on at a more rapid pace with more homes built and more violence against Palestinians, which inevitably has the effect of throwing many of them off their land. And that this has been going on to such a greater extent during this coalition regime than ever before. So now we have E1, which you explained. Essentially, this is different. This is not adding on to settlements that are close to the green line. We know that the major block of settlements have always been considered to be part of the two-state deal, where the major block of now 500,000 people would stay, and there would be a swap, and the Palestinians would get an equal amount of land. But those settlements hug the green line and um, don't go that much into the West Bank. E1 is totally different. E1 will have the effect of cutting off the north from the south. It will make a Palestinian state, if it were to stay, basically unlivable. You wouldn't have an integrated, united country in which people could move back and forth and do commerce and see their families, etc. So you're right. It's not necessarily the nail in the coffin because some of this stuff can be turned back. But if it were to go ahead and if it were to be increased, then you're going to have an increasingly difficult time in turning it around. If you ever had a government in Israel that said enough is enough, we have to make a deal, and that deal means a contiguous and significant West Bank that would go along with Gaza. So it's scary. I support, as you do, targeted sanctions in the West Bank. We have targeted um, groups that advocate settlements. We've targeted the ministers, and we should be targeting. I think you're absolutely right. Construction companies that are involved in basically attempting to do de facto what this government's not allowed to do by Donald Trump de jure.
Yeah, and I think the thing as well, talking about just kind of the Canadian Jewish reaction or the Canadian government reaction, we were talking a little bit before that our survey, we survey the Canadian Jewish community every year. Our survey is just out for the survey that was in market in late November. And we know that, we asked some questions around the two-state solution, and a few things that were really interesting. We still see, even after 2 years of war, we still see that the Canadian Jewish community, the majority of the Canadian Jewish community, says that the two-state solution is the best solution to the conflict. In fact, the number has gone up very slightly from the last time we asked the question. We also see that when we ask it in slightly different wording, like when we don't use the word two-state solution, but we say regional as a part of a comprehensive regional normalization agreement, that number actually goes up to 62%. And we see that even the people who said no and didn't support a two-state solution, when they hear regional normalization, that includes a Palestinian state, 45% of the people that say no all of a sudden say yes. And so, I think that part of our work at JSpace and part of what we're trying to really communicate is not we're angry at Israel or we hate Israel or we don't want to be connected to Israel. It's actually to say, look, as a community that is very connected to Israel, cares about Israel, defines itself as Zionist, we are noting that a two-state solution and regional normalization is what we want to see for the future of the region. And I really want people to kind of make that connection a little bit more, that these actions that are taking place are really, if not, like you said, if not the nail in the coffin, a real threat to it. So, I think that kind of understanding what we're saying and how actions of the Israeli government contradict or make our voices more silent. I think we have to be a lot more bold and brave in speaking up, because it is getting quite dicey.
So let's talk about that
Sure.
regional
Yeah.
solution. Every Prime Minister of Israel, from Begin on, has sought to include Israel as part of the Middle East, knowing, of course, that Israel is a Jewish state and those are Muslim states or Arab states, whatever you want to call them. That was a long, long time goal. Frankly, as you know, after the Abraham Accords, during the Biden administration, there were serious negotiations between the Saudis and the Americans and the Israelis on a deal. And it was going to be a significant deal. And once the Saudis are on board on a deal recognizing Israel, that means you've basically got everybody, because the Saudis are the biggest holdout, and they are the largest, most important country in the region. And then the other Gulfies would fall in line, and so would many other countries. We also know that one of the reasons that Hamas struck when it did was because that deal was getting close. Mm-hmm. And that deal was getting close, except for one thing. The Saudis demanded movement on the Palestinian question. Okay? Yeah. And so that was part of the negotiations. They never got the green light from the Israelis. Before those negotiations could continue and finish, October 7 happened, the war in Gaza happened, and now we have a situation where, because of what's gone on in Gaza and because of what's happening in the street in the countries, that the terms of the deal are now even stricter vis-a-vis Palestine. The Saudis have made it absolutely clear. You got a lot of people saying, oh, the Saudis, nobody cares about the Palestinians. The Saudis obviously care about the Palestinians, because they didn't join with Trump in moving this peace deal ahead. They're sitting on the sidelines, and they're not going to do anything about a regional agreement until they get a signal Now, they're not demanding, we're not dealing with you unless there's a state, but they want a clear pathway to a state, a bona fide, sincere effort to sit down and negotiate with the Palestinians, whoever they may be, post elections, hopefully, etc. And this government will never do it. We know that. So there will never be this regional deal that everybody wants and that even the naysayers say would be good, because if there was a
Right.
regional deal, Palestinians were part of it. Even the Arabs and the Gulf would make sure that the Palestinians were not screwing around on this. Help the Israelis as the PA does now. But so we really have to wait for another government that sees the importance of this for Israel, not the Sparta that Bibi Netanyahu talks about. We can survive alone. Israel could never survive alone, and Israel doesn't want to survive alone. And you can just imagine how many bright, young Israelis will leave a Sparta Israel. So this is very important, and it's so interesting that those numbers go up when people see that, well, Israel can really benefit, but they can only benefit if they get the monkey off their back and do it, in a way that keeps them secure, and eventually, they have a relationship with Palestinians.
Yeah, and I mean, we should just note as well, I think we've talked about this before, but it is important to note, I'm talking about numbers of Canadian Jews. People could say, well, we don't live there, et cetera, et cetera. We know that the numbers are the same for Israelis. We actually see that the same thing happens with Israelis, where maybe the wording of two-state solution is not popular wording, or there's not support for it, but the same thing that happened with us happens with them, where you ask about broad regional normalization, et cetera, and consistently those numbers from various different organizations that have polled, and we can link to some of them in the email, we see that it's consistently the same thing. So you have a people who are ready for this, and to borrow a phrase or to turn a phrase on its head, we've got Netanyahu, who never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity, I think.
On this case, you're absolutely right. 100%.
Great. Jon, so good to talk to you. Thank you so much. Glad to have you back. I am not back, but I am still around doing this video, and I will be back next week. So thanks so much, and we will speak again soon.
Thank you very much.